Sunday, 8:30.
And the political debate continues, of course, with Andrew Neil and the Sunday Politics in an hour here on BBC One, with analysis from Polly Toynbee and Toby Young. That's after Nikki Campbell asks the big questions.
Today on the big questions, fueling the fires of terrorism and breaking confidences from the confessional. Good morning. Good to see you. I'm Nikki Campbell. Welcome to the big questions. Today, we're live from St Edward's School in Oxford. Welcome, everybody, to the big questions. Now, since Wednesday afternoon, our screens, newspapers and social media have been dominated by just one story. The mayhem wreaked by Khalid Masood on the streets of Westminster with a hired car and 2 knives. 50 people were injured, 7 of them critically. 5 people have died, including Masood, who was shot by the police. It was an appalling and devastating crime. But so far, nobody actually knows why he did this. He didn't say anything, he didn't post any messages on social media, and he didn't shout, Allah Akbar. Islamic State claimed responsibility, hailing Masood as a soldier of Islamic State. There's no evidence he was linked to them in any direct way. He had a criminal record for assaults, he'd served time in prison, and that may be where he converted to Islam. MI5 investigated him some years ago, but it wasn't currently on their radar, yet everyone has assumed he was an Islamist staging a terrorist attack. Acres of newsprint, hours of television every day since then have been devoted to speculating on the motives behind his actions. Now, if it was his intention, and if it was attention and publicity he was after, he got it. Back in 1985, Mrs. Thatcher said, "We must try and find ways to starve the terrorist and the hijacker of the oxygen of publicity on which they depend." And she actually banned us, many will remember, from hearing the voices of the IRA or Sinn Féin politicians like Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness. Are we right to give terrorists the oxygen of publicity? Peter Hitchens, in the Mail on Sunday, you've written a column today, and you've got the line in it, we have become a nation of unreasoning weepers, laying flowers, lowering flags, lighting candles, while not thinking at all. What do you mean?
Well, I mean that we, immediately these events happen, we put a grid on top of them and say, this is what it is. The police, within minutes of the outrage, were saying, this is an act inspired by Islamic State. They had no objective evidence of that at all, and as far as I know, they still have none. My own view of these things is they have an enormous number of possible explanations. But there is one thing which is consistently ignored. And if you look, if you put the class of events wider than just these obviously Islamic ones, and you take in, for instance, Anders Breivik, you take in the school shootings which happen in Germany and Finland, and also, in my view, if you take in the rampage killings which happen very frequently in the United States, where no Islamic influence is involved at all, what you invariably find is that the person involved has a past of petty criminality involving the use, almost invariably, of mind-altering drugs, legal or illegal. It does seem to me that this is actually an important subset of crime. And I'm not saying all people who take drugs, and that people lie about what I say, and I have to protect myself against these lies. I'm not saying all people who take drugs become terrorists. I'm not saying anything as stupid as that. I'm not trying to excuse Islamist fundamentalists from evil intent where they have it, because that would also be absurd. What I am saying is, if we look at something like the record of Masood, for instance, you see a petty criminal who began very early in his life to take mind-altering drugs. You might find a better explanation of why he undertook this horrible act, if you looked into that, than by clamping onto this immediately, the grid of Islamic extremism, and going into top panic mode.
But he converted. But what about the coverage itself?
Well, coverage itself is invariably useful. The point of the media is to uncover things, and huge amounts of things have been uncovered about Masood in the past few days, which we otherwise wouldn't have known, thanks to media diligence. No one should complain about that. The point is, do we then make sense of it or not? One of the interesting things about Masood, for instance, I called Scotland Yard when they named him and said he had a long criminal record. I said, can you give me his full criminal record? You know what their response was? They wouldn't tell me. And this, to this day,
it's not as if it was sub judice, because he's dead.
To this day, his
coverage,
full criminal record has not been revealed, because they weren't interested in that. They were interested in the Islamist connection rather than in his record of crime.
So
maybe he is just a criminal committing a horrible crime.
Maybe he is just a criminal committing a horrible crime, Douglas Murray, and the fact that there was this assumption that he was somehow linked to Islamic State. Islamic State clearly made a great amount of that by saying he was one of their soldiers. Aren't we playing into their hands?
Well, the reason why people assumed that he was doing this, at least was inspired by Islamic State, is because it's something that Islamic State has called upon people around the world to do, using exactly this sort of methodology. Islamic State has said for some years that since various cells in the West have found it very hard to get hold of the technology to make bombs in recent years, they've been disrupted from doing so. Since it's very hard in the UK, for instance, to get hold of Kalashnikov rifles, ISIS has called on people in countries like this who follow their message to carry out attacks using vehicles, very low-grade attacks, knives, you know, this sort of thing. So that's why it fits a pattern of ISIS-inspired attacks. So we'll find out exactly, or some more of what motivated him in the days and weeks and months to come. As for the question of publicity, this is a huge question which we're always wondering about. This was a good week, after all, wasn't it, to wonder about terrorism and our attitude towards it in general. Martin McGuinness, I think responsible for more deaths than anybody else in the UK in recent decades, died and was eulogised in the House of Commons. 24 hours later, the House of Commons was attacked by another type of terrorism. But I think this is a very bad sign for this country. The way in which we treat terrorists of the past tells us how we will treat terrorists of the future. I'm glad that was such a powerful point in the studio, but
yeah, listen, Douglas, you have your fans.
But this I think should really worry us. During the IRA's campaign, people said we would never give in to terror. All MPs, policemen, and others all said the same thing again this week. But the record shows in this country that we can give in to terror and have, and so. You know, the whole issue of media coverage, as it were, by comparison with that fundamental societal problem, is relatively easy to solve.
So we're playing their game,
That's
basically.
rubbish, I think, what you've just said.
Yeah, but
Mohammed, why is it rubbish?
Well, let's just go for the basic principle, first and foremost. Two men behind bars. One looked down and saw mud, the other one looked up and saw stars. What you'll find with organisations like Douglas and some of these right-wing organisations is they will always pick up the worst.
Attacking Douglas already.
No, they will always pick up the worst. What we had this week was a fantastic unity of every community coming together and reflecting the grief of a nation, innocent people being murdered. We had bravery from police officers. We had standers by helping out. We can focus on the bad or we can focus on the good. And the good is, if this is all they can do, they're not getting very far, are they, the terrorists?
There's something else that seems, there's something else that seems to match the MO of ISIS, and it was the killing of Joe Cox by Thomas Mayer, who actually killed an MP, and only two Labour MPs said it was an attack on democracy. No one else echoed that. And so here's the issue:
I think lots of people said that was an attack on democracy.
From MPs and prominent individuals, I think mostly it was the Labour Party individuals that were saying so. But the point here is that there's many individuals who've coming out to do acts of terrorism, and there wasn't as much focus on Thomas Mayer, arguably, as there was on other previous attacks of terrorism that has occurred in the UK. And these are questions that we have to.
Well, that's because
raise.
That's quite simple why that was, because there was an impending court case. In this case, there is no impending court case because he was,
but there's a live
shot
inquiry.
Dead.
There's
there
is
a line inquiry. There's no issue of sub judice. Do you think they're comparable, Anne-Marie, the murder of Joe Cox, for example, and what happened the other day?
No, look, and we're doing it again.
We're doing what again?
We're avoiding the common denominator in these attacks. Of course, terrorism comes from all different areas, but we can talk about Islamic terrorism in its own right, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we should be able to.
Thomas
And
Mayer is
again,
Islamic?
all week,
Thomas Mayer is
I'm not
Islamic,
talking
though?
about. I said they're
You said
separate
the
things.
common denominator.
I'm talking about these apparent random attacks, like the one we saw in London last week, that we're putting down to a random criminal. How many random criminals of the same faith are we going to have before we look at the elephant in the room? And it's been in the media all week. We will never know what can possibly have driven him. And the only thing not a possibility is religious belief. And the fact that a person has been involved in crime or has taken drugs does not exclude them for having... no, they're not. I mean, even the Prime Minister, in the Commons this week told us very matter-of-factly that this was a perversion of a great faith. She didn't offer any scriptural backing for that. In fact, she said it without any analysis or investigation of Scripture at all.
But she also said it without any evidence as to the motivation, of the individual as well.
Peter Hitchens, let's make a factual point here for this discussion. In the past couple of years, we've had two events in this country. One, the Leytonstone tube station stabbing, and the other, the Russell Square stabbing in London, which were initially attributed to Islamic fanaticism. It was later perfectly clear, beyond all doubt, that the person involved was actually crazy. The Leytonstone stabber believed, and psychiatrists go, he actually believed, and you'll have to savour this fact, that Tony Blair was his guardian angel. This is not a person who can be taken seriously as a political actor. If you look also at various events which are attributed to Islam on the European continent, particularly the Nice killing by the man Boulel, he was said by his brother to be an atheist. He never attended the mosque. He ate pork. He was a boozer, he was a wife beater, he was a petty criminal of a long-standing record. Something very similar was the case with the man who drove a truck down the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. A bar brawler, an arsonist, a petty criminal and thief.
If I may say so.
If you're looking for the origins of these things, it doesn't mean none of these episodes are Islamic inspired.
Let me put this to Anne-Marie and then we'll open it up. Other people want to talk on this, but isn't it hugely counterproductive for what you want to say about this religion and what you believe this religion leads to if you all of a sudden jump on every single atrocity and say it's because of this religion?
I'm not suggesting we should jump on every single atrocity. What I'm saying is we need to include religion in the list of possibilities of what drives these people. Not every one of them. Everyone's not the same. But we cannot honestly discuss this without an examination and analysis of the religious scriptures. I also want to know what these people are saying themselves. When police in Germany, for example, declare someone to be mentally ill, why? What are they doing? What are they saying that you conclude that they are mentally ill? We have a right to know this. We have a right to know what these people are saying and doing before they carry out these acts.
Rashad, we haven't heard from Rashad yet, but
I'm just going to help the other side by telling them.
I'm bearing you in mind for future comment. Don't worry. Rashad.
I think this conversation, if I don't mind, kind of demonstrates the issue. No one has a problem with discussing the facts and the media discussing the facts. Just to return to the question for a second.
Yes.
Actually, the problem is the editorialising. It's the manner in which the facts are presented by people that say have a particular agenda and therefore will horseshoe anything into that particular agenda.
Yeah.
Or, for example, the speculation. So we saw the media responses. I mean, we saw fairly good responses actually this time from the BBC, kind of measured, weighted responses to what happened. We saw other outlets speculating about who this person was.
Channel 4 News.
And others actually just released names without actually fact-checking simple things. You know, other institutions did. They literally rang people's solicitors up to verify, is this person around? Actually turned out the individual that was named is still in prison. Other people contacted the family who said, no, it's definitely not him, he's in prison, etc. So what you had was a phenomenon where people that had a particular agenda which they wanted to pursue, other people who are reacting to social media, because social media is way quicker than any of the institutional medias. So what you have
That's because it doesn't do any checking.
Right. So you actually have really poor journalism coming out as a result of, you know, which is what the problem is. It's actually when you remove away the journalistic instincts, people are going to fact check, people are going to verify things before actually putting them out. And when you did have that, it's less sensationalist, it's less agenda driven. And so therefore
it's very emotionally charged, isn't it? So
it's much less emotionally charged to be able to sit back and say...
That was a very emotionally charged event, given the tremendous amount of tragedy that came from it, but also the inspiring acts of humanity that we saw as well, and just the nature of the attack on democracy, and then all the human stories emerging over the following days. And it's good to know about those acts of humanity. It's good to know about the human beings behind the tragedy, those who were slaughtered. And that's an important part of what the media... Don't you think so?
I absolutely agree with Rashad's point of view as somebody who does work in the media and is obviously clearly and evidently observant Muslim, and I'm part of both worlds.
What do you think about the tone of the coverage in general?
It's really important, and as a role as a journalist, that you do your job and you do it well. So that goes back to the accuracy, that there was misinformation pledged out this week, and the problem is social media is so quick. So where certain outlets or networks have taken their time to fact check and get the accuracy, and they've delivered to the public that news, that is our duty first and foremost as journalists, to do a job and do it well. The problem is, and it's across all sectors, so that's broadcast, print, digital, online, we abide by editorial guidelines, and it's so important because when we don't, it undermines our credibility and the work that we do. And it really does. And it's a mockery of the job that we do. And our job is to serve the public, and our job is to give the correct information.
Well, there's the photograph of the woman with the hijab on social media crossing Westminster Bridge. Yeah. And from afar, it looked like she was ignoring the tragedy unfolding around her and being, heartless. But if you actually looked at the closer photograph, it was of her face. Yeah. She was extremely distraught, and she was possibly phoning for help, or she was phoning to tell
she's issued a statement.
Her friends and family.
You're familiar, but she's issued a statement.
Yeah,
she has issued a statement, and the photographers actually released the other photographs around.
She had helped people.
Image.
Indeed, so.
I think anybody in that frame of mind, at that position, I can't imagine anybody walking away from something like that. That's not a sense of humanity.
So, Douglas, this is huge. Don't you think, Douglas, this is hugely counterproductive, because then you are adding to the feeling in communities that they are being persecuted and they are being stigmatised, and then that adds to their agenda that the demonisation of Britain. So it's a feedback loop, isn't it?
But I don't think we've got into that. I don't think that's been what's happening. I think it's been very, very...
Has it been happening?
I think it's been very...
it hasn't been issued statements.
Look, what are you talking about the EDL for? I mean, I'm talking about our society as a whole, OK? In our society as a whole, and our media as a whole, there has not been any crazy response to this. The media, by and large, has done its job. It's been fairly restrained. I agree that there is a time, definitely, for all of the discussions that have come up already. By the way, quickly on this thing about motive, and I think we shouldn't attribute motive until we know, but we should certainly look into the cases where drugs have been involved. I think it's long overdue to consider that. I also think we're long overdue to consider the role that religion can play in these attacks as well. These are not mutually exclusive. There are many people who have carried out Islamist attacks who have been, eating pork, drinking and so on, and then do what they do precisely as an act of, as it were, religious purification. That's very common. So these things are not... the 9/11 hijackers went to strip bars and all that kind of... these things are not exclusive. They're a very, very complex picture that leads somebody to carry out this sort of thing. But we should be having a wide-ranging discussion on it. Thankfully, on this programme we can, but quite often in our media and elsewhere we don't have as wide-ranging a discussion as we should. And our politicians in particular are clearly terrified of aspects of this discussion.
What are they OK, we're open, we're honest, we have a frank exchange of views. What are our politicians scared of saying?
Well, first of all, they're scared of saying, actually... the amount of people proclaiming this week, we will not allow this to change our society. I mean, who on earth thought it would? I mean, who thought that a guy with a knife and a car was going to bring down British democracy and cause the Queen to abdicate and put the flag of Islam over Buckingham Palace?
But Douglas, one of the things which has happened ever since the terrorist attacks during the Blair era is that governments have used these attacks as a pretext to take away important liberties. Yeah. And Benjamin Franklin said long ago that if you sacrifice your liberty for temporary security, you'll end up having neither liberty nor security. But our governments have flagrantly ignored this. Longer detention periods without trial, more intrusion, more snooping.
Is that a danger, Douglas?
This has changed our society. What politicians are very much afraid of is that people will discover how very little power they have to prevent these attacks, and far less than they pretend that they have, and that they actually cannot do the things they claim to do. And this is
in a second,
a pretext
I don't think Douglas is
reason.
quite finished. What do you think about what we heard from so many people? We will not be cowed. What did you think about that?
I mean, it's a very good thing that people think that and say that. But I mean, I think some of the response to this, I mean, this was not the Blitz. This was not a sustained night after night campaign. It was one attack, a brutal, horrible attack in the heart of London. But and to that extent, sort of emotionally, and I agree with what Peter wrote this morning, we have to be careful not to be overreacting.
A policeman was killed, and when a policeman is killed, Keith Palmer, it always strikes at the heart, doesn't it?
And people, and our society says and has said very clearly.
But Nicky, a lot of us here lived through the IRA bombing campaigns in London. We remember piles of dead horses and indeed dead human beings in Hyde Park and Regent's Park on the same day. Actually, we didn't go into lockdown or half-mast or minute silence mode then. We thought, all right, these people are our enemies, we will put up with it. Our government were the ones who let us down by actually giving in to IRA bombers and giving them pretty much all that they wanted and going to Martin McGuinness's funeral.
They're actually contradicting what they're saying.
Who is?
Douglas, because on the one hand, you're saying, look, we don't want to cower to the terrorists, we don't want to be singing their agenda, and yet the first thing everybody uses is the word Islam. Well, listen, in this particular state, I was actually in Scotland Yard on this case, so I was there on the day. To qualify as an Islamist incident, it has to fit a certain criteria. And it was discussed earlier on, but no one actually mentioned why this was classed and why it was taken over by SO15 as an Islamic incident. Otherwise, it would have just been homicide that would have taken over this case. There are certain criteria. For instance, if he said the word Allahu Akbar, that would have been clearly an Islamist incident. If he had had a flag of ISIS, clearly it would have been Islamic. He didn't have any of those. He didn't say anything. He didn't leave a note. The only thing that makes this a counter-terrorism...
he was a Muslim?
No, not even that. It was because he wasn't we don't know if he was a practicing Muslim, because he clearly wasn't a very good Muslim, was the
What does that mean? What does a very good Muslim mean?
Well, if he's into... He was taking cocaine. He was into... wife bashing, all those things. If he was a Muslim, he wouldn't be taking cocaine and having, drinking alcohol. But it was because he attacked. Let me just finish the point. The reason was because he attacked a political institution, the heart of government. That was one of the reasons, if you like, that qualified it. He's in terms of practicing, that's still coming out. We don't know whether...
Well, you've just said what you think. You've just given us your view, which is that it's nothing to do with Islam. And other people will have a view that it is. But I'm suggesting that as a society, we actually take the time to work out people's motives. But it's very clear that in your case, for instance, you wouldn't want it to be ascribed to an Islamic motive. Even if it was turned out that he had a copy of the Quran in the car, you would say it had nothing to do with Islam.
We would have accepted that.
There are people, let me finish the point, and there are people who would say it has something to do with Islam, even if it's very clear that it has nothing to do with Islam. But there are, in this whole thing, my simple point is that we should be looking at the motives, and at the moment there are parts of the anti-terrorism and counter-extremism strategy where the government is, and politicians are very worried about treading on it. And you saw it, as was mentioned earlier, in Theresa May's comments in the House this week, where she immediately ruled one aspect of this whole thing out.
Abdullah, in a second, I just want to go to the audience, if I may, to get any comments about the way this has been covered. Lady over there with the scarf. Good morning to you.
Morning. I just wanted to say, when it actually happened, I was almost, not in fear, but I was just wondering how quick it would be that there would be the word Muslim or Islam actually in the report.
It was quite quick because he was a Muslim.
And it didn't take long for that to happen.
OK, but what about the way it was covered? Does it give the oxygen and publicity to IS, for example, who claimed some connection, and they would, wouldn't they? And also think about previous conflicts, the way we have covered terrorist outrages there. Is it counterproductive, the way the media covers it? Now, of course, we have 24-hour media, so it's perhaps exacerbated by that very fact.
I think they have, they do cover it, and they do cover it, all the papers, everything, the headline the next day. But I think with social media, they kind of have to, because it's all out there very quickly anyway. People are making comments on social media and spreading it around that way. But yeah, that was my, I was just kind of waiting for it, and it's just amazing how quick it happened.
OK, and yes, sir, hand up.
I don't think you can ignore it as it's such a big event, but the fact is I was quite pleased in the sense of where the media reacted with a positive message. So they showed individual acts of bravery, and they also showed things like the cartoonist with the big Ben sort of standing up in defiance with the big muscles, rather than the sort of the fear and the cowardice. We must sort of give more of a positive message, the fact that they won't change the way we act, and London and the UK will carry on.
Yeah, in the white shirt at the back.
I think as humans, it's innate in us to want to seek very simple answers to incredibly complex questions. And I think what happens in the media a lot, and we've seen it today, is people want to jump on one thing because that makes it very easy to understand. But I think if we, as the media and as a society, looked on things as a sort of more mental health issue, as Peter Hitchens said, mental health services are appalling in this country. It's very, very difficult for people to access those services, and I think that is the way where we need to look to actually make a change in our society to make things better.
Well, yeah. Abdullah, what did come out of this, and it was a good thing for focusing minds, is that 13 serious terrorist plots have been thwarted since the killing of Lee Rigby. We heard about that. So I'm sure you want to pay tribute to our intelligence services. They're doing a fantastic job.
I know, but today's discussion is about the press and the media and so on. And one of the problems is the speculation and the constant reiteration that goes far beyond what was covered or how the IRA attacks were covered. And I must remind everyone that the IRA killed more British people per year during the Troubles than any quote-unquote IS-inspired or Al-Qaeda-inspired terror attacks. And we keep forgetting that.
What do you mean quote-unquote? Why?
Sorry?
What do you mean quote-unquote? I mean, they are IS-inspired.
Sorry, so quote-unquote, I was going to say Muslim, so they describe it to Islam or Muslim attacks. They are Al-Qaeda and ISIS-inspired attacks for the ones that do claim to be. So this is the issue, because what is the objective of terrorists? Their objective isn't necessarily to kill all infidels, because we don't see terrorism in South America or South Africa or Switzerland or Republic of Ireland. But what we do see is they desire to scare the British public and the French public and the American public to secure political goals. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS don't have the power to scare people in John O'Groats and Land's End. But the media, which reiterate these attacks and speculate and give them...
Were you not scared? The point of the question I asked,
yeah,
which you slightly didn't answer, you're not scared by the fact there have been 13 terrorist plots thwarted, foiled since 2013, and also thousands of people on the intelligence services watch list up and down the country. Now, in a population of 60 million, that's not a lot, but it's an awful lot of people who are inspired by this. Anne-Marie, do you want to come back on what he was saying? Because I saw you...
Just say, look, I'm happy that terror attacks have been prevented, and I hope that we see no terror attacks from any cause or any group ever again. But today's discussion is really about whether these terror attacks or the terrorists should be given the oxygen of publicity. And publicity or infamy is its own form of celebrity, and we don't want to give these terror attacks the celebrity they don't enjoy. They should not enjoy.
I'm going to speak to in a minute, Peter, about the IRA and as well, and your coverage of that and our coverage of IRA atrocities in the past. But Anne-Marie,
what's the alternative to the oxygen of publicity? I mean, are we expected to ignore these things altogether? What is it we're actually looking for here? I don't think we're giving it the correct coverage at all. I mean, Douglas described it as a single terror act. In London, yes, but how many terror attacks have there been across Europe in the last couple of years? And what have they got in common? And with this, can we not use our common sense and sit down and look at the religion that is possibly driving this? Why are, and let me ask, when the IRA were doing what they did everyone scramble to find an excuse? They were criminals, they were involved in drug abuse, they were mentally ill, or did they accept that they were Irish Republicans with an Irish Republican aim?
Well, some were involved in drug dealing.
Why can't we do the same? And if there's no problem with Islamic scripture inspiring this, then let's look at it. Why aren't we looking at it? Why is it? If it's not Islamic scripture, then we have no problem.
Wait a minute, Zaba's going to come back on that. But surely the point is, you establish the facts, you get the facts right, you infer from the facts what may have happened, then you report what did happen.
That's what I'm asking for, but I don't think that's
what you're saying we should start with conclusions.
No, I'm not. I'm saying we want the truth. We want the truth. We want to, and I want religious fervour to be included in the list of reasons that made this man...
Well, I don't think anyone is
wait, Peter, in a second. Saba. Yeah. You were looking like you weren't agreeing with that when I was looking.
I agree to parts, but not all of it. Okay, so when you speak about journalism and accuracy, of course, and we all want the truth. It's not just you.
I disagree
it's me.
That we all want the truth.
Okay, so let me tell you for myself, and I can speak on behalf of perhaps 99% of the British Muslim public, that generally none of us know the motives behind people who carry out these acts. I myself am very much part of this society. I'm born and raised a Londoner. I'm an observant Muslim, and you don't see somebody like me carrying out these acts inspired by my faith. Therefore,
that doesn't mean that the people who do
I'm not saying I'm not, and people are analysing scripture. It's not whether it's the Quran or the biblical scripture. You seem to be quite hung up on the fact that this is a Quranic scriptural point.
Scriptures are open to interpretation, and literally.
If they're not quoting scripture, why are we bringing scripture into this? If they're not quoting scripture,
because a lot of them quote the verses that say, "Find the infidels, root them out, and kill them."
I debate these.
Douglas wanted to come in. Douglas,
come on. This is a great example of it right here. Mr. Al-Andalusi thinks that none of the terrorists ever quote the Quran. Flat out wrong. Flat out wrong. Let me give you one example. You mentioned it earlier, the killers of Lee Rigby. Michael Adebolajo, on his body, when the police arrested him, he had a note in his pocket to his young daughter explaining why he did what he did. It's all on the public record. You can see the facsimile on the BBC's website, and he has footnotes throughout it of Quranic verses that he explains justify, in his view, his actions. Now, that's the beginning. Hang on, let me just finish my point before the proselytization begins, okay? Let me just finish my point. That would seem to me to be, therefore, a very clear occasion, never mind the thousands of others we could list worldwide, a very clear occasion on this country when one of our soldiers was murdered on our streets, where clearly Scripture had something to do with it. So the problem that a lot of us have is we are willing to discuss the drugs bit, we're willing to discuss the foreign policy bit, we're willing to discuss all this. Why are you not willing to concede that there is a religious element? Sometimes.
No, wait.
We are missing the main point.
Mohammed first. Now, listen, here's my plan. Wait a minute, everyone's... No, you had a fair shot. Here's my plan. I'm going to speak to Peter in a minute. I'm going to take it to what happened in Ireland over the period of the Troubles. And I'm going to let you... I don't want to make it theological.
No, it's not theological. The one point that hasn't been mentioned that is absolutely relevant to all of this is the radicalisation of people in prisons. I have seen people that don't practice come out of prison as red-hot radicals.
I'm sure you've seen people who come out of prison as converts and you celebrate their conversion as well. I mean, it can clearly go either way.
The point here is what is happening. We've put them into a state institution that should be a safe zone. They are coming out as, ISIS recruits.
Anjem Choudhury has had to be separated from the other prisoners so that he doesn't...
so what I'm suggesting here is this particular person could have been radicalised.
But we don't know
Peter Bush. Peter, in a minute. We haven't heard from Peter Bush. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Welcome. What do you think, Peter, of the coverage of this? Department of War Studies, King's College London. Do you agree it was important over the days to hear the human stories, to hear the human tragedies, to hear the stories of heroism? And that's what unfolded in the newspapers, apart from the analysis. Was that right, the way this has been covered?
That part was certainly right, to tell both sides of the story, to get as rounded a view as possible. But where you have to be careful, I think, also when we listen to the discussion here so far, is when you think about oxygen of publicity, part and parcel of the idea of terrorism, what is really behind is this attention-seeking. To affect more people with this act of violence than the people who were actually there at this particular part of London. And when you then talk about media coverage and what you cover and how you cover it, you have to be careful not to follow some sort of script that seems to be written by the act of violence itself. So it's not just the media reaction, but it's also those people who are given voice in the media, who talk, who want to talk in the media, be it from a political point of view or be it the politicians in general. For example, clearly something that many people would call a symbolic act or symbolic place was attacked. But we decide whether this place is symbolic. So Parliament, do we say this was an act of terrorism against democracy? But that's our decision. So our reaction is very important in this case. It could have happened in Epping Forest or something like this. Would we have reacted the same way? But this is the choice this perpetrator of the act did. And we have to step back, I think, and think about it and make the decision, do we want to follow a certain script that this person wants us to follow? So we talk about an attack on us all and so on and so forth. Or do we try to stick with the facts? Do we try to stick with the simple story, try to unravel what is behind it, and then draw conclusions?
Well, social media has changed the game. Peter, talking about, and more contributions, please, from the audience in just a second. It's changed the game, social media, but in Northern Ireland, I remember, I've spoken to you about this before, you followed Gerry Adams around America, didn't you? At every press conference, Gerry Adams gave you his worst nightmare, asking...
Nicest thing you've ever said.
There was Peter Hitchens at the back, and you can see Mr. Adams facing, oh, of course, it's him again. So you were... The thing is, though, we had that period, didn't we, when Mrs. Thatcher said, do not give them the oxygen of publicity. And we had the ludicrous situation when actors' voices were dubbing the voices of Mr. McGuinness and Mr. Adams, occasionally, subvertively, as I know from a producer at the time, leaving in a cough that belonged to Mr. Adams. This, I mean, it was a good job for the actors, but it was a ludicrous situation.
No, it was futile, and it illustrates the great difficulty of what one does about this. One of the major French newspapers, Le Monde, tried to stop using the names of these perpetrators and was turned on by most of the rest of the French media for failing to take the thing seriously. I think we all have a difficulty. We can't ignore this stuff. We have to give it an awful lot of coverage because it is a big event. The question is how we cover it and whether we cover it intelligently or not. Here's another thing. That's a discussion we've just been having about what's in the minds of these people. I speak as a former fanatic. I was a Trotskyist in my teens and 20s. My mind was full of utopian, violent garbage. I didn't kill anybody. The gap between the gap between being a fanatic and being a killer is very considerable. And I think that what we're not really investigating is this. And you turn to Ireland and you look at someone like Martin McGuinness. Well, what he did personally, we don't know. But he certainly ordered large numbers of deaths. Now, what actually happens to someone to make him want to do that? The roots of fanaticism are not just simply a matter of belief. They're a matter of believing so strongly that what you think is right that you can kill. Or, in some cases, they're a matter of being so disinhibited by the collapse of your reason that you will do very violent things. The difficulty here is in telling which is which. There's no question that Islam and Islamic fanaticism has been involved in a lot of terrorist acts. The 7th of July events, the September the 11th events, beyond all doubt. Sure. But that doesn't mean that all these events have to be fitted into that.
Do you celebrate, Rabbi Romain, do you celebrate the peacemaker, Martin McGuinness?
I celebrate that he changed. And I don't think the British authorities gave in to the IRA. I think the IRA actually gave in to the rule of law, justice and institutions. But I think the key word here...
Who pulled out their troops?
Hang on.
Who dismantled their intelligence system? Who disbanded the RUC? Who kept their weapons? Whose prisoners were released?
Who interrupted?
The IRA won.
OK, thank you.
The
key word here is proportion. In other words, we can have information without publicity. Obviously, we have to report what goes on, whether it's the IRA or with Masood, but we don't have to overindulge. And yes, I mean, it's been astonishing. There's been many more deaths than the 4 people, terrible as they were, that died at Westminster Bridge. Yeah, they don't get half the publicity. And it's a right to show the backstory of the victims.
But when a policeman dies, it always strikes at our hearts.
Oh, yes, of course. But we don't have to have the backstory of every single witness and therefore have 10 pages 4 days a week. And really, one of the problems is actually the media itself. And maybe we used to have just sort of half an hour on the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news. Now the media actually needs the terrorists to feed in their news. And there's some kind of an unhealthy relationship. I'll just finish this point. There's an unhealthy relationship between those who create news and the media who actually need it to keep 24 hours going.
Isn't it feeding something? Essentially, we can look at the media as a medium of what people want. So the reaction, the truth is, why does the media focus on certain stories for longer periods of time? It's because that is what the British public are interested in. Exactly. And partly, it does shape attitudes, but also it's essentially just a reaction to what's happening. Yeah. So when we look at things like this...
We need explanations, Rashid. We need somebody to blame.
Sure, but there's also this thing about...
speculation, though.
So as an example, we were having this conversation earlier. There were 200 people that were killed in Mosul as a result of arguably an attack by which the US have said it was them. and it hasn't had the same coverage everyone says. What? But there's a reason it hasn't had the same coverage, just because there isn't the same appetite for that coverage. It's still there for people who are interested, who want to look at it, see what's happened.
So it's a commercial consideration.
It's a commercial consideration.
It's also
very quickly, we have to come to the end.
Obviously, 24-hour news pushes a lot of this. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation because we have the 24-hour news culture. However, there are things about that are unhealthy. But it's nothing like as unhealthy as the fact that if you look back, as I said at the start, about our attitude to terror of the past and our attitude to terror present, when the IRA killed MPs and many policemen and many soldiers, what did we end up doing? We ended up putting the people who had orchestrated that campaign at the heart of government. And that is far sicker. The idea that 20 years from now, anyone who was associated with Khalid Massoud would be put into power, that's far more of a societal sickness than 24-hour news media.
Saba, I'm going to give you the last word, Saba. We've got another debate coming with very interesting people to talk about it, and it's a fascinating topic. But generally speaking, the coverage of this week, has it been self-defeating in that it has given unnecessary oxygen to those people who would destroy us, or has it ultimately been responsible and the right way to cover it?
It's a double-edged sword. I think overall it's been quite responsible. However, there have been some tabloids and some news that has gone out, as we all are aware, that has been misinformation, and things such as, Birmingham is the jihadist capital of England. That's not helpful unless it's backed up by evidence.
It is.
And
it's actually not the capital; it's the second capital of terror.
London is the capital.
London is the capital of terror in the UK. Birmingham is second.
Debatable.
No. If you look at the stats released earlier this month, it proves that.
But do you know what? I'm going to have to come in on confession, Saba. We're going to discuss that in just a moment. If you've got anything to confess, anyone, that's all coming up. Thank you very much. You can join in all this morning's debates. Log on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions. Follow the link to the online discussion and tweet using the hashtag BBCTBQ. So tell us what you think about our last big question. Should the secrecy of the confessional be sacrosanct? And if you'd like to apply to be in an audience at a future show, email audience@menton.tv. We're going to be in Brighton next week and Cambridge on April the 9th. Then after a break for Easter and the London Marathon, we're back from York on May the 30th. 2 shows, the usual live programme in the morning, plus a recording of a special on humanitarianism in the afternoon. So do email audience@TBQ that address if you fancy taking part in any of those debates. Confession, good for the soul, they say, telling God your sins, perhaps through the medium of a priest, expressing contrition, making amends for them is an essential part of faith, as old as the Bible. And the same idea underlies modern psychotherapy too. Now, if you can't come to terms with what you've done, you can never move on or lighten the burden of your past. But where does this leave your confessor, the person you have opened your heart to? If he's a Catholic priest, the answer is clear. He can never tell anyone, not his bishop, not the local police, not the partner you may have betrayed, what you have said to him. But should all confessors follow the same rule? Are there times when the enormity of what they've been told requires disclosure, perhaps to a potential victim or to the police? Should the secrecy of the confessional be sacrosanct? Jonathan Romain, Rabbi, you've written a very interesting book on this, and I'll come to you in just a second. I want your response to Dr. Peter Petkoff, Centre for Christianity and Culture at Regent's Park College. Peter.
Hello.
There you are. Now, if over the years some priests had taken the information from the confessional and gone to the police, think of the misery that people would not have had to go through. Think of the torture that people who had been abused would not have had to have lived with all their lives. Think of the people who would not have been killed by terrorism. To keep it in the confessional is surely, unarguably, wrong.
Well, you could make this argument from the point of view of general, using a particular moral paradigm, that if our moral choice is to the pursuit of truth, and if that requires breaking a particular confidentiality agreement, we therefore have to break it. And this has been historically the position of utilitarians who have argued that breach of confidence in such situations should be allowed.
Isn't the morality pretty simple?
But there is the other argument, which is we maintain confidentiality simply because that's what gentlemen do. If we have promised to keep secret, we keep secret. And law, and canon law in particular, have tried to really create a balance, not only in relation to confession as confidential information, but also in relation to a number of other types of privileges.
If somebody comes to a priest, do you believe, if comes to a priest and says, I have a sexual interest in children and I am acting upon it, I want your help on this, would you go to the police?
Well, I'm not a priest.
Should the priest go to the police?
Well, this is, if he's a Catholic priest and he has a choice either to lose his priesthood and to be excommunicated for breaking a very specific ecclesiastical law, or to save a child. It's a personal choice he has to make. It's not an institutional choice.
Rabbi Romain, should that be a difficult choice?
No, I'm quite appalled that it's even a choice in the first place, to be honest, because, obviously confessions have to be handled with care and sensitivity. But actually, if somebody is going to either harm others or even harm themselves, then there's actually no religious doubt whatsoever that you do have to break confidentiality. It may be against the religious rules, but those are man-made, and actually you have to put human needs in front of religious rituals. And there's a big difference between confession against your sins against God, the service you missed or whatever, and you can pray away those sort of things. But sins against fellow human being, they can't be prayed away. You actually have to rectify them. And if somebody came to me as a rabbi and said, look, I'm a paedophile, I can't control myself, I know I'm going to do it again, I would say, look, you have to go and hand yourself in. Or I will come with you, or if you do not, then I will go and tell the police. And frankly, I could not look the mother in the eye of his future victim and said, I knew what was going to happen, but I didn't tell you.
Of course, we're talking about different things, because what you're referring to is a confidential pastoral advice you may give in private
what are you talking
with
about?
a member of your congregation, whereas as far as confession is concerned, and in specific contexts, because not all Christian churches take the same view on confession and secrecy of confession, there are different degrees in which that's taken seriously. But if we're talking about Catholic Church or Eastern Orthodox churches, confession is so central to the Christian identity of these two churches.
It's sacrosanct.
That changing it, removing it, requires such complex institutional and theological change that it will prevent Christians from being able to fully
I think little
appreciate.
Children's lives come before institutional change.
But that's...
sometimes I'll finish on this, religious leaders have to have the courage to change when the rules of the past are no longer relevant.
Can I just finish? Chris, you can in a second. Let me bring Chris in, just in the time we got. It's fascinating. Chris, is it sacrosanct, the confessional, what goes on in there?
For the Catholic Church it is, because confession is a sacrament and forgiveness depends on the intermediate nature of a priest. But we discussed this in General Synod 2 or 3 years ago in the light of the issue of paedophilia. And the issue is this. Confession is backward-looking. Confession is about people with troubled souls who are concerned about things go to somebody to unburden themselves and to talk about it and to seek forgiveness. Now, it seems to me that unless they can go to somebody in whom they have absolute confidence will not disclose it, to whom else will these people go? They'll go to nobody. It seems to me that the position that the priest is put in is to withhold forgiveness and absolution unless that person then goes, he says to them, as Rabbi Romain has said, you need to go and tell this to the police.
And he says, I'm not going to, because I want to...
Then
what?
Then you have to remain confidential, because...
Well, I'm going to do it again. That has to remain confidential.
That's forward-looking, and then you work with them in terms of counselling, in terms of other things, but you do not disclose.
Quote, I can't stop my urges. I am going to do this again. Unquote. No disclosure.
No disclosure.
Stephen Law.
Well, I find that a pretty appalling attitude. I agree with you that if children are going to be harmed and we can do something about that, then we should act. I think what's going on here is that we'll expect doctors and psychologists and counsellors to break confidentiality agreements if there's some very good reason to do so. And in fact, we will legally require them to do
There's
that.
no legal requirement on
But there's
priests.
no, strangely, it's one law for there would appear to be one law for those who are operating within the secular sphere, but then there's another law, and there are other requirements placed on those who are working within the religious sphere. And as a political secularist, my feeling is that there should be a level playing field here. There shouldn't be one law for the religious and another law for the non-religious.
Can we cover this legal point?
Yeah.
Because what I think is really important is when you were talking about the IRA, that was an era of the past. There is now updated legislation. So, for instance, whether it's a priest, a rabbi or an imam, and if a young man comes up or any person comes up and says, I'm off to Syria, or I'm off to drive around Westminster Bridge and I'm going to knock over a load of people, the Counter-Terrorism Act requires that person now to disclose that information, otherwise they will be arrested. I think it's under Section 59. So I think things have upgraded a little bit. You don't
What's
have
the
a
legal
choice.
situation, Chris?
This has been discussed for hundreds of years, particularly over the issue of treason. If somebody was, and it came up over the gunpowder plot and everything like that. It has always been the case that canon law, the law of the church, has been regarded as foundational in this matter, except when the matter comes a matter of the criminal law. Then, if the criminal law is involved, then there are other issues. I understand that. But my point is that unless there is somebody that somebody can go to who they know will not confide, they're not going to confide in anybody. So we're looking at a very extreme case here.
And it will not
of
happen
somebody
in the
who's
first
going
place,
to. It's not really going to happen, is it? That somebody says, I'm going to do this and I'm going to confess to the police, to a priest. Somebody confesses to the priest because they're troubled by something, and if they know that the priest might share it with.
We know the child abuse cover-up
they're not
happened for decades.
Sorry?
In the church. We know the child abuse cover-up happened for decades in the church. That confessional conversation will, I'm sure, have happened on very many occasions. Let me put this to you, Peter, because you were mentioning the IRA earlier on. What if, in the confessional, an IRA bomber were to have said, and we know about the so-called, labelled the provo priests, were have said in confessional to his priest, I'm going to carry out this atrocity. I hope my Lord and Father forgives me, Hail Marys, whatever. Should that priest have gone to the police?
Well, I'm a Protestant. I have no particular interest in this. I don't subscribe to the sacrament of confession. But just looking at the argument, we seem to be approaching it as some people approach torture. By producing an example which isn't realistic. I'm utterly and completely opposed to torture. I don't believe it is under any circumstances sanctioned. And the reply to that was, what if there's a ticking time?
Oh yeah, I know that,
the reason
the child abuse situation
there
was
has
very
never
real.
been such an episode. I do not believe, actually, that IRA terrorists went and told priests they were going to kill people. I also believe that if someone takes the sacrament of confession seriously, he will also believe that he will burn in hell if he abuses a child. It's rather unlikely that such a person is going to...
Stop right there.
The whole thing is a hypothesis.
No, it's not a hypothesis, because the terrorists would have told the police after they'd done the atrocity. They were told the police after they'd committed the atrocity. We know that. Should the police have then gone to...
you'll have to formulate this,
but today,
that
the
again.
police would be arrested.
I'll formulate it again for you. After the atrocity...
I'm not here to defend the Roman Catholic Church, to which I do not belong, nor am I particularly interested in the sacrament of confession. What I'm saying is that what is being advanced here is an extreme and unlikely hard case hypothesis to attack, if I could just finish, to attack the practices of a particular church. And I don't find it particularly convincing.
Let me give you a simple everyday case that's less extreme. One of my congregants came home, found her husband in bed with his secretary. She told me confidentially she was delighted. The reason was because actually he'd been abusing her for years and years. She'd never had the courage to say anything, didn't want to go public. Now she had a legitimate reason, a respectable reason for the divorce. The problem started 3 years later when he actually went out with somebody else, got engaged. Now I knew confidentially that he was an abuser. This second wife, or potential wife, was a very feisty lady. I thought she could look after herself, but on the other hand, a person who had abused once, faults of the past, could abuse again. Should I break the confidence and tell the fiancé that he was actually a wife beater? And in the end, I decided that silence was the worst option and that she had a right to that information. So I broke the confidence and I did tell the fiancé. So those are an example where I think actually you do have to put the interests of other people first.
But who did she marry him? Did she marry him?
No, in the end, a few weeks later, they split up.
Okay.
Which is a very good example, but it's actually very different. We're talking about very different things.
No, you wanted an everyday example. I gave it to you.
Well, yeah, we got an everyday. Yeah, gentleman at the back. Hello, good morning. Welcome.
Basically,
quick points.
Basically, when you look at the scriptures, if you look at Romans 13 in the Bible, King James, it says you must submit yourselves to authorities. And also in Acts 5, it tells you quite specifically that you have to follow the law of the land. So where you see criminality or someone is doing something wrong, you have to submit to that biblically. So really, I just see it quite benign. When you're looking at the case of terrorism or whatever it is, if someone is committing a crime, you have a duty of care to your other fellow human beings to react in a correct manner.
Yeah, with a beard. Hello.
It's just a level of the criminality here, because where it's a personal thing, as we saw from the rabbi, that can be quite a constructive thing. But when we come to the point where you're breaking the law, I think you obviously have a duty to report that. And actually there are laws which say, for example, you could be perverting the course of justice, you could be accomplice to a crime if you don't report it. There are aspects of the terror legislation where, again, if you don't report it, you are part of the problem. Now, at that stage, everybody, I think, has a duty to actually report it. And I think, looking at the person who's possibly giving this confession, you're actually helping them by doing that. And I think that's a very important stage.
Anyone else over here? There's a threshold. The back, white shirt, yeah, hi.
Yeah, all religious figures have a duty to uphold the sanctity of human life. So by withholding that information, they are not doing what they're there to do. And if they're putting their own faith before the sanctity of human life, that's selfish.
Douglas,
it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, you put a very hard case of a priest in a confessional knowing about a paedophile. If I can say, if to widen that out a bit, consider the number of people in our society who haven't sworn that they would keep secrets, but have done for personal reasons, community reasons, or social reasons. Look at the number of people who must have known, for instance, about Jimmy Savile's abuse. And they kept silent, not because they were sworn to by something, but because they felt the pressure of it. So it's quite easy to sort of think of this as being a sort of the hardest problem for a Catholic priest. Actually, it's a society. A lot of people in our society cover over things whilst moralising about things like Catholic priests.
And as a practising Catholic, one does wonder what might have been revealed in the confessional when he was in church. Any other comments? Come on. Yeah, we had you earlier on. At the back, lady there. Yeah, that's you.
I'm sure that hiding things makes you an accomplice and makes you a criminal as well. So it's a very serious issue when it comes to child abuse and stuff like that, being a sufferer myself. If I could have been saved, I would have loved it. I was an ex-Hindu, I'm not religious anymore, for the very same reasons that people hide things when the moral obligation is that you're supposed to save a child, you're supposed to save people who are actually dying, because the impact of that is way massive than you may be burning in hell after you're dead because you don't feel anything anyway. So it's ridiculous. You're ruining people's life who they'll have to live afterwards. It's not acceptable.
The issue here...
We're running out of time, Chris, so it's a quick one.
The issue here is, if you remove that, then there's nobody that people who are troubled by these things can go to. Nobody. What sort of society is that, then?
Yeah. And there is...
We are out of time. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. As always, the debates will continue online and on Twitter. Next week, we are in Brighton. Please join us then. For now, goodbye from Oxford and have a wonderful Sunday. Thanks for watching.